So welcome, friends, to Crystal Clarity Publishers Ananda Sangha Worldwide. This is the first in a series of author interviews we're having for Crystal Clarity, and it is my great joy and privilege to have Nalini Graeber with us here today. Nalini is the author of a very important and timely book called Transitioning in Grace, a yogi's approach to death and dying. Nalini, thank you so much for taking the time to be with me today.
It's my pleasure.
And where are you there? Is that that looks like a virtual background. You're not.
Yeah, it's a virtual background. I am at the village, so it's not too far off.
At the village, for people who don't know, that you're talking about Ananda Village in Northern California there in the foothills.
It doesn't look exactly like this, but it's beautiful outside.
It's not, I have lived at the village with you, and it's not too far off from what it looks like. So I wanted to start to, give you some space to share with us, because this book is more important than ever with what the world is going through with the pandemic. And I was mentioning to you as we were getting set up today, that we have a friend in Los Angeles who recently both her parents passed away from the coronavirus within a 2-month period of one another. So you can imagine a very intense time period for her in grieving. But I'm wondering what would you say to her, and for that matter to anyone that their relatives are getting close to transitioning? Is there a way that the yogi's approach can help one prepare for death and dying?
There's a lot of questions in that question. Okay, well, I'll start somewhere. Yeah, well, actually, a lot of people have told me that reading my book has helped them to overcome their fear of death and help them to feel more prepared and that kind of thing. So there is that, and we can talk more about that a little bit later. But in terms of your friend who lost her parents, I feel such a compassion for that person. I myself have lost both my parents and my only sister as well. I don't know what your friend's experience was, but for me, losing both is a lot harder than just losing one. I mean, we never want to lose our parents. And it's so beautiful in the autobiography where Master talks about losing his mother and the great grief that he went through. And that, actually reading that chapter used to telling about Master and his mother and his grief, his intense grief, used to give me some comfort, actually, just knowing that our Guru had been there himself. He wasn't just saying, get over it, and grief is not spiritual. There was none of that, just complete acceptance and understanding. So I just found that very comforting. And especially after I lost my mother. In my own case, I first lost my father, then several years later my mother. And then just when I thought I was doing okay, I lost my sister. And so there was no one left in the family except me. So I can really feel how hard it must be for this person. But there's so many resources these days in terms of hospice and support groups and all that kind of thing. I mean, she should certainly take advantage of all that. One nice thing that's in my book is we have a copy of the astral ascension ceremony is and memorial service is in the appendix to the book. So just in case, I mean, in this case, I'm sure she probably already did all that, but if a person didn't have their own church to go to, they could make up a ceremony based on that. Also for preparing, we have a copy of Swamiji's final exam article, which has a lot of helpful hints in there. And in addition to all that, the book contains concepts of the evening hospice, which is a letter Swamiji wrote probably around 2005 or so, to sort of, how he used to plant seeds. He was always talking about planting seeds, seed ideas that he would hope the rest of us would take and run with. And that was a good example of that. He didn't create a whole evening hospice organization himself. He just left all the seed ideas and hoped that someone here would do something with that. And of course, Hanuman Bachman in Portland, Oregon, did grab that and run with it. And he founded a whole, adult care home based on these concepts. So that was really beautiful that Swami's goals came to fruition.
Yeah. A couple more follow-up questions from what you just shared. I appreciate you sharing how that reading about Yogananda and Autobiography and his mother passing and how he went through that grieving process and how that was actually comforting for you. How do you have suggestions for people that are going through a grieving process that at the same time they don't yield to despair? I think Swami Kriyananda wrote in a song, "Why multiply grief with despair?" So I'm wondering if you could speak to that, how one can authentically go through a natural grieving process, but at the same time not get sucked into a downward whirlpool of despair.
Yes, that's a very good question. It's a fine line, between, you don't want to be faking it all the time, just, plastering a smile on your face that isn't really genuine.
Right.
So you want to be honest, but you don't want the grief to overcome you. I know when I was going through the same period that I was just speaking of earlier, especially somehow, my mother dying was much harder than losing my father. I did what also sort of followed Yogananda's example of seeking the Divine Mother. The song Dark Eyes, based on always looking for his mother's two dark eyes and finally seeing them everywhere, kind of thing. So I definitely sought out the Divine Mother. I remember, besides chanting to Divine Mother, trying to go into nature a lot, a way of communing with Divine Mother. I was living in the Bay Area at the time, so I had access to the ocean a little more than I do now up in the mountains here. But, so I would go for long walks on the beach, or if it was a nice day, sit in the sun and just let that sunshine, the warmth of the sun, really nurture me. Tried to get out of nature as much as I could, because I really felt Divine Mother's presence there. Whether in the ocean or the beautiful mountains or whatever, the babbling brook or whatever it might be. So, I don't know if that would work for everybody, but I think it would help a lot of people.
And this concept of God you're speaking of as the Divine Mother, that was really comforting and helpful for you at that time, especially.
I mean, it's always nice to get out of nature, but for some reason it had a real significance for me at that time. Because I would really seek out Divine Mother, talk to me through nature. You know, Swamiji has a beautiful walking meditation. I should have put it in my book. But anyway, we can get a copy of it to someone who's interested. But you walk through nature, but you know, if you hear a bird singing, you think, well, maybe that's Divine Mother speaking to me, or has a particular message just for me. And so even all the various sounds and sight, it's a personal relationship between you and Divine Mother. It's manifested in that way. And that's the kind of thing I would, in addition to everything else, that I would recommend to someone in this situation. The other thing that has made a huge difference for me is just plain service. You know, if there's any way you can be together enough, calm enough to help other people in whatever way it is, you know, cooking them a meal or trying to cheer up somebody who's in the hospital or even in prison or whatever. The more you can be a channel for helping them, the more your inner self will heal. I mean, that's been my personal experience.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Nalini. I was reminded from what you were just sharing about serving and giving in that way. It seems like that's always a key for us to expand our sense of self-identity, like you were talking about, walking in nature, getting out, hearing the birds, them reminding you of Divine Mother. And I was reminded of a story in your book here that I had just read this morning as I was, preparing for our discussion today, about Tim Kretzmann, and at the end, towards the end of his life and transition, that he was experiencing this really intense pain. And I believe it was Peter, his one son, who was there with him, and he started to chant a mantra to, I think it was Lord Rama, and that after chanting that mantra, he went through a transformation, that his consciousness was uplifted and that pain was insignificant. Do you remember this story? And is that...
Oh, of course. Yeah. Well, first Peter was playing that really beautiful chant, "How shall I love thee? With every breath I breathe." And so that had a lot of significance, because his father, Tim Kretzmann, who the whole chapter is about, was obviously, because of his cancer, unable to serve in the usual ways, or even to meditate or anything like that. But it came down to his breath. He could breathe. He could breathe God, so to speak. And Peter could too on his behalf. So that was kind of the first step of the journey. And then somehow they got into whether they were doing Sri Ram, Jai Ram, some other kind of mantra, or call on the power of Lord. Whatever it was, it really worked, according to Peter. And he sent a relief to his father, and being inspired to Peter.
There was one phrase that I don't remember it verbatim, Nalini. Maybe you remember this part where Tim said something. This sort of struck me, that he said, "When you're small, pain is overwhelming, but when you're big, it's nothing." It was something. And here was a man who was at death's door, and he could say that with truth, with the power of conviction than his own direct experience at that moment. So
and somehow the Ram mantra helped him to expand and be in that bigger space. Bigger space looking down on himself instead of being overwhelmed.
It reminded me of, I believe Swami Kriyananda wrote once that pain is the fruit of self-love, whereas joy is the fruit of love for God.
I believe you're asking how the book can help someone overcome fear. Some amazing examples in the book of just that kind of thing. We all know that those of us who are yoga practitioners know that we're trying to deal with the central nervous system, and trying to at least balance with the parasympathetic and have less of the sympathetic fight or flight response to things, which is truly a challenge these days. I mean, there's so much to worry about and be afraid of that it really does take all one's willpower just to maintain an even keel. I mean, speaking for myself, anyway. But at least with yoga, we do have the tools, physically, mentally, and spiritually to help us find that calm center. The book gives some really beautiful examples of that. The chapters about Maria Warner and Bella, her sister. Both Bella and Maria were devotees at Ananda. They originally lived in Russia and managed to escape. And as they happened to be, I'm sure it was their past karma, but they were both so detached. It was just amazing. So Bella, as she approached the end of her, they both died of breast cancer, which they had gotten. I mean, it ran in their family because their mother also had died of breast cancer. So, but anyway, as it got close to the end, Bella she was kind of blissed out and just totally not relating to her body. I mean, her body was doing its thing, but she didn't identify with it. And similarly with Maria, when her breast cancer went to the brain and so on, so she knew she didn't have long to live. She actually says to her beloved husband, detach yourself, and then control the reactive process, which is a phrase we use a lot in yoga. Live the teachings. So she became famous for these 3 pieces of advice that she gave to her dear husband, who was wheeling her in for some surgery or procedure. And I mean, I just found that so remarkable that she could speak that way for herself, not only for herself, but actually say that to her husband. I don't know if I would have the inner strength to talk that way to someone I loved. So she was quite a character, actually.
I remember this story, Nalini, of Maria that we were talking about. And
yeah.
Wasn't that she had just found out that the cancer had come back and she thought it was in her brain, and there was her husband wheeling her in the wheelchair. And that's when she said that, control the reactive process, detach yourself.
Yeah, well, they had just done a ministry trip to, I think, Dallas, Texas, where he gave some Kriya programs and she gave Sunday service.
Yeah, so I think that's, to me, one of the most encouraging things from this book is reading these personal accounts and the courage with which people approach death. Was there one particular, I know there's many stories in here, but are there any that stand out in that way for you from this book, or any from your experience that they've given you that sense of the freedom from fear that we've been talking about around death?
Yeah, well, like you said, there's so many great examples. But Vairagi is a really interesting one, because she actually did have a fear of death. You know, it's not like she just breezed through this whole thing, you know, with an innate courage and no fear of death. These were obstacles in herself that were very real to her. So, so I found, besides the fact that she was a dear friend, and I, you know, was with her right near the end there, she was so inspiring to me because of her attunement to Swamiji and to Master, and because it was her attunement ultimately which helped her to overcome the fear of death. You see what I mean?
Mm.
So, I mean, it doesn't really help to talk to a person outside of Ananda and say, well, you know, look at this other person in my book who didn't have any fear of death. You should be like that. You know, that's a pretty tall order if you're not there already. But in the case of Vairagi, she wasn't there. But because of her great love for Swamiji and her love for Master and her constant effort to attune herself to them, she was victorious in the end, and she overcame her fear of death.
What happened, Nalini? Can you tell us a little bit about her story towards the end?
Yeah, well, she had cancer. One thing she did that was unusual is that she actually jumped on an airplane and went to India to see Swamiji, even though she was in really bad shape physically.
Mm.
And she got a male friend to help her do that, to deal with the physical pain. But I mean, that's just a good example of how her love for Swamiji was paramount, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And they motivated her to do that. And it turned out to be worthwhile because Swamiji did invite her over, you know, I think every day that she was there visiting, and he gave her a lot of energy. So I'm sure she was very glad that she went. She probably would have gone sooner, except she was waiting for the doctor to say, you feel, you know, you're getting better, so now you can travel. And then instead the doctor said, well, you're getting worse. You're probably going to die. And so then she said, well, okay, I'm out of here. I'm going to India. I think she almost kind of hoped that she might leave her body in India,
Mm-hmm.
you know, because of the great blessing involved. But she was an amazing person in terms of her attunement to Swamiji and her willingness to attune to Swamiji. She would listen, you know, to him chanting Om, but not just that, to, you know, many treasures talks or any talks that he had given, anything with his voice or Master's voice, she would listen to for hours on end.
Mm.
And she knew that Swamiji had encouraged me to write, you know, because this was true way back then as well. And so she would say that she would ask for my help in writing Swami letters, you know, from her to him. And so I was privy to some of this for a while. And so what I noticed is she would, you know, she wrote to him this really long letter, you know, pouring out her heart and everything. And then Swami wrote back like maybe 1 or 2 sentences at the most, you know, just a very short, abrupt letter. And so I was just sort of horrified actually, because I thought, oh, this poor woman, she's she's poured out her heart. She's, laying her whole heart and soul at Swami's feet, and all he's given her is this one sentence or two sentences, whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like she had me read that little letter, those one or two sentences. She had me read that to her over and over again.
Wow.
So that she could glean any hint of meaning or any guidance for her life or whatever that was hidden in these words. You know what I mean? It's like that was her desire to attune to Swami was so intense that she just made the most of every opportunity. It was the only way I could put it. And I just found that so inspiring, and Swamiji did say that she went out in glory. He's used those words. So in other words, I don't think he was trying to say that she was liberated. She probably wasn't liberated yet, but I mean, for where she was with this particular lifetime, he implied that she had really made a lot of progress this lifetime, and that's what it's all about. And I was so happy for her, to hear that.
Yeah. Well, that's a remarkable story. I mean, to hear that her first impulse too was to go to India and see her spiritual teacher, to see Swami Kriyananda, to get his blessings. I think like that alone, as you were sharing, speaks volumes about her character, and to try and take in any message or meaning to help prepare her. Speaking of the preparation, we've been talking about the pandemic and the fear that people are going through around death and dying, and there's also a stigma, right? Of course.
Oh,
I was reminded of Happy, that you wrote about in Transitioning in Grace, and her experience with HIV. I was wondering if you could share maybe a little bit about your experience with her and her story, because that also was very moving for me. How one can break through sort of these social stigmas, if you will, of having infectious disease, and how does one break through that with, again, resiliency of heart and courage and using sweet reason. Was there something of your experience with Happy that you would want to share in that regard?
Oh gosh, she was so inspiring, because at the time that she found out she had AIDS, which was in the 80s, at that time it was pretty much, they didn't have all the cocktails and treatments and therapies that they do now. So at that time it was pretty much a death sentence kind of thing to get a diagnosis like that. And so it's quite remarkable that she did end up, living another almost 10 years, even though originally they had given her 6 months or something like that, to live. So, and she did that primarily through studying master's teachings on healing, with affirmation. She was really big on affirmations. In fact, she went around to all the centers teaching affirmation classes after she had sort of gotten it together herself. And she changed her diet, exercise, energization, meditation, all the techniques of our path she employed toward healing. And so that in itself was extremely inspiring. And she really wanted to help. I was speaking earlier about service. She definitely one of her goals in this lifetime was to learn to serve. And so she really accomplished that goal and did it in a very creative way, because she had been an actress.
Mm.
And she liked to write, and so she had all these talents and abilities, and she put it to use to try to educate people about AIDS. She put together a whole program called the Ribbon Walk, which was about her own personal journey with AIDS. On all levels, physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. And then she would go to various schools, just high schools or junior colleges, that kind of thing, and perform her ribbon walk, and then pass out pamphlets about AIDS and what it really was, and how you could live with it and still have a good life, and all that kind of thing. So, her desire to serve was just amazing. And so she ended up being this very inspiring person, despite, what she was battling with.
So again, service, it was a big part of her healing. And I think I recall from what you shared about her story in your book, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think she had a near-death experience when she was younger, maybe when she was 18 or 19 or something like that. Is that
Yeah.
what? And in that experience, one of the things when she was conversing with the light or with God,
Her guides, yeah.
her guides, right, was that she said she hadn't yet learned to serve. And so that this experience of having HIV and then going out and serving in such a dynamic way, like you were talking about for 10 years, that, wow, again, these stories are so touching, because I don't know, to me, this is so important for us, especially right now, because with the kind of rampant chaos and everything with the pandemic, it's very easy to get off center, like you were saying, and get sucked into your own little melodrama. These stories just completely break you out of that and remind you of the God's eye and God's perspective, and that everything that we're given, like what she, having contracted HIV at that time in the early 80s, like you said, when there wasn't a lot of information and there was a lot of fear around it, just like there is right now with the pandemic. Her response was not to contract, her response was to expand. So that is so helpful for me to hear those kinds of stories.
Well, her response was to expand because she was tuned into Swamiji, and he encouraged that, of course. Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about your experience with Swami Kriyananda? I'm reminded, there's the Indian saying that one moment in the presence of a saint can be your raft over the ocean of delusion. You met Swami Kriyananda many years ago and have had experiences with him. Were there things that he said or did that have really been an indelible mark upon your life and the preparation for your life beyond?
Yeah, well, definitely Swamiji has been a huge influence on my life. I'm very blessed to have had many moments with him, since you were talking about one moment in the company of a saint. Because I came to Ananda in the early days when he was much more accessible and could spend more time with us. Actually, a lot of those moments were just spent having fun in the really early days. And I just wanted to point it out that Swamiji always had that vibration of joy, that he wanted to share that joy with anyone around him. I remember having a conversation with Brother Turi on Messereth down at the Lake Shrine. He would always say, because he had known Kriyananda when he was still part of the organization, he would say, when Kriyananda was here, the halls rang with laughter, is how he put it. And then since he's gone, it's just quiet. There's none of that anymore. And I thought, well, that's really nice. And because it was that vibration of joy and magnetism that drew everyone together in those early days at Ananda. I was quite blessed. Probably the most good karma I've had this whole lifetime on a spiritual level was back in the early 70s. I went to India with Swamiji and Jyotish and another girl who's no longer with us. And it was just, it was just a totally life-changing trip. We saw Ananda Ma.
What was that like? So you saw the great joy-permeated mother. I mean, here we are talking about transitioning in grace, but the goal of life being bliss and transitioning in a state of bliss. You met Anandamoy Ma, the joy-permeated mother. What was that like?
Well, what was so special about it was, of course, her relationship with Swamiji, because the two of them, they didn't have to say anything, really. They just had that knowingness, that bond between them. They just loved each other so much, but it was on this very spiritual level. So that was really sweet. The whole trip was, we were gone about 2 months. I mean, it was a long trip and had a lot of blessings we started out, I think we started out in Hawaii for a couple of days and then went via Japan to Thailand for a few days there, then India for probably about 6 weeks or so, and then back through Europe and East Coast. So I know I'm so eternally grateful that I had that time with Swamiji. You said what kind of mark has he had on my life? Well,
do you feel that you have deepened your contact with Swami Kriyananda? He passed away in 2013, right? Almost 7 years ago. But having written this book and just out of your experience with him out of the body, have you had a deepening inward contact with him, and how has that helped you?
Well, to be quite honest, I wish I had more of an inward connection with him, but I definitely felt his presence and guidance a lot while writing this book, because he wanted me to write this book. He had asked me to write on this subject. I wouldn't have necessarily chosen it just all by myself, even though both Anandi and Asha had recommended that I write the book. But it was really Swamiji saying, this is a really worthwhile, good subject. I want you to write about this, So um, that gave me the the willpower and the dedication to really stick with it until it was done. It's amazing how much is involved in writing a book. I never could have dreamed. There's so much more than just what you would expect in terms of writing, editing. I mean, there's all the energy you put out on that level, and and also the research, in the interview. So it seemed like hundreds of people, and I'm sure it wasn't that many, but for each chapter, there were usually lots and lots of interviews, depending on how sociable the person was and how many people they knew, and that kind of thing. I'm trying to think where I was going with that.
You felt Swami Kriyananda's blessings, though, in writing the book in particular, you were saying, and that he really, those blessings really helped you to complete it. I mean, I feel that, Nalini, from it. I think this is such an important book for people right now, any age, universal experience that we're all going to go through, and how to approach it.
I guess what I discovered also in writing the book is the whole concept of Tapasya.
What does that mean?
It means self-sacrifice and austerity. I mean, Swamiji's talked about it a lot in terms of, starting the work in India, getting the village established. That anytime you try to do something positive, whether you want to call it Satan or whatever you want to call it, there's this negative force that comes back at you to try to prevent you from doing it or something like that.
Right.
It's hard to know. I mean, you must experience that to some extent in your work in Los Angeles.
I can relate. Yeah.
Yeah, because you and Don Davy are the leaders, and you have your aura wrapped around the whole work, and there's a real role there. I mean, you have to maintain that aura around it in order to survive all sorts of storms that come your way.
Yeah.
And you've done a marvelous job so far, so that's really uplifting for all of us.
Well, and like your book, Guru's Grace, Transitioning in Grace, and did you feel that, Swami Kriyananda always said, I didn't do it, right? I wrote the 150 books, the 400 pieces of music, the communities. I didn't do it. God did it through me. Did you feel a sense of God being the doer with this project and writing this book?
Yes, you definitely. Yeah, it's very humbling in a sense, because even though people are saying, "Oh, we love your book," or "This is great," or whatever, you know in your heart that God did it. I mean, you try to say that too. That's not. People don't really want to hear that usually, unless they're also devotees on this path. They don't understand more why you're saying that. But yeah, it's a very uplifting and humbling experience to feel God is the doer.
Let me ask you, Nalini, a question for people that are with their loved ones there when they are passing, either at home, hospice, hospital, whatever the situation may be. If I'm there with a loved one who is passing, are there any yogic or spiritual guidelines or things that you would suggest that that I do to hold the space for that soul to transition in an uplifted manner?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things you can do. And the nice thing about my book is if you read a lot of the different chapters, you'll get a sense for the variety of possibilities, I guess, is what I'm thinking, because each of the story, each person's passing is unique. They each have different flavors or different styles of, like we were talking about Maria and Don. Both of them were very inward, quiet people who didn't want anybody around when they died except maybe their husband or one other person or something like that. They were just very private. And then you have other people like Paula who wanted to have a farewell party. And so she, invited all these people to come, and cookies and ice cream, and latte, coffee lattes and all this kind of thing, along with sharing, in a social way. This all took place in a hospital room, believe it or not. So there's each person's style is just, and what they individually want is so different. A lot of people, like I think Happy was this way. They plan their whole astral ascension or memorial service ahead of time. They have it, all planned out. I want this person to talk, or I want these paintings to be there, or I want every person there to receive a copy of the Autobiography of Yogi, that sort of thing.
It's funny you share that, because Dharma Devi's mother just recently passed away, end of January this year, and she had planned her whole funeral service out in that way with the readings and the music. So I guess it's different for every person, right? There's no...
Yeah, some people liked, the take charge types like to plan it all ahead of time like that. Like, they take great satisfaction in knowing that their loved ones will be at this event and hear these things and see these things and all that. But I mean, you were speaking of actually being at the bedside of someone.
Yeah.
And the book has a lot of ideas for that too.
That's great.
We often, Swami even says somewhere, put your finger at the person's spiritual eye and will bless them, basically, but also you're trying to help them bring their attention to the spiritual eye and keep it focused there. And I know Vairagi was a good example of that. She had people come, and that was one thing that she would request a lot. She would have master chanting or Swami chanting, especially the Om tape or the mantra tapes. She'd have all that going on in the background. Then she'd have people coming over and praying for her and putting their finger in the spiritual eye. And she's also a person who, she really loved the astral ascension ceremony, which is in my book. And so while she was still living, she had her spiritual friends come and read that to her, sort of like so she could meditate on the words, because the words had been written by Swamiji for one thing. So it was a way to attune herself to Swamiji and to attune herself to the whole process of leaving the body and detaching from things here, going on to the next plane.
Those are all really helpful suggestions. And that astral ascension ceremony you're referring to is in the book as well.
Yes, it is. Yes, I actually have another friend who's not on our path, but she loves my book. And so she, you know, and so even though she doesn't live at Ananda or anything like that, she would take the book and read chapters of it to her friends who had terminal illnesses. And her friends loved it. You know, their friends said, come back and read me some more happy stories. Because the stories cheered them up because
Yeah.
the way people were facing.
Exactly. I think that's what I was trying to express to you earlier. This is a universal book. This is for everyone. Similar to how I think Swami wrote that book called God is for Everyone. You know, transitioning in grace is for everyone. This is such an important book. And so people can find it on, we'll put the link in the video below here on Crystal Clarity's website. And Nalini, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to share with us on this all important topic, and what you've done in putting this together it's a absolutely precious gift for really everyone. And I want to help just spread the word and share this book with people, because it gives you so much hope and encouragement and light that we need at this time.
Well, that was my intention, was to be an instrument of light, to bring that to the subject, instead of it always being this dark, secretive, let's not talk about it kind of subject.
Are there any parting words you would share with us?
Gosh. Well, just to remind ourselves that grace, I mean, this is one thing that Anandamoy Ma said to me when I was in her company. We had brought her all sorts of malas and pictures and, you know, incense, statues, all kinds of things we wanted her to bless. And so we put this whole pile of things at her feet and said, please, Ma, please bless this. And her answer was, you know, why are you asking this body to bless these objects? God's blessing, God's grace is always showering down. And I think that's true, that there's plenty of grace showering on us at all times, but we have to be receptive to it.
Mm.
So that's my wish and my prayer for everyone who hears this, is just open your heart to that flow of grace, which is already there. We just need to open and receive it.
Thank you for sharing those words. That's a beautiful reminder for us all, Nalini. Again, thank you so much for your presence today and for this work and for the light that you share with the world. Many blessings, and I pray, if it's God's will, that we can see each other in person.
Yes, it'd be wonderful.
Well, many blessings to you and our family there at Ananda Village, and thank you again so much for taking the time to do this today.
Well, thank you for asking.